So for this lesson, we're going to be going through some of the key ideas of socialism. And if we look at this picture here, it's making a point that to be socialist is to fight capitalism, is to be anti-capitalist. And many argue that socialism actually came about as an antithesis to capitalism. But is that true? The socialism's core principles run deeper than just being against capitalism. What are those principles and how do socialists follow them? And in its simplest form, socialism is an opposition to injustice created by capitalism and aims to prevent a concentration of wealth which is gained by the exploitation of markets and workers, advocating instead for community, cooperation, and inclusivity. So it's substantially different to liberalism as an idea. On a core part of that, it's simply different in the sense that it's an ideology about collectivism, it's about community, rather than an ideology about individualism. And in essence, the way that this pans out in the economy is that capitalism sees privatization. So production, distribution, and exchange is privately owned for private wealth. So essentially, everything in society should be geared towards making profit. The values of things in society come from how much profit can be made. What's the monetary value rather than social value and things like that. Socialism, on the other hand, advocates for the production, distribution, and exchange, so in essence everything in society, to be owned by the community for the common good. So capitalists' aims is about the generation of capital, the generation of wealth, whereas socialism is about social, it's about society, and it's about the common good. Socialism grew quite substantially in popularity in the 19th century. London, for example, was a hotbed for socialist ideas, and people almost took it for granted in the sense that it seemed like a socialist revolution was imminent in London, which is also what Karl Marx advocated for. And that was due to the vast industrial change experienced since the Industrial Revolution. But the 19th century in particular was quite problematic in the sense that London was growing quicker than space would allow for. It became a metropolis, so over 1 million people living in the city. And then there started to be the segregation of the rich and the poor. So rich people lived in these lovely leafy suburbs as they fled the city and the overcrowding, whereas poor people lived in working class slums. And from this, this class consciousness, this class character began to be formed, not only in the different wealth and even living standards that was experienced, but just the fact that they were geographically different too, in the sense that they lived in different places rather than in the same sort of vicinity. But socialism didn't just come out of nowhere, didn't just come out of discontent in the cities in the 19th century. And actually the principles and ideas of socialism, so things like community, can be seen as early as the 16th century in this poem by John Donne, where he argues that no man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind. Essentially, individualism is the idea that is against human nature, is what socialists would argue, because it's our natural state to be in a community. We are naturally social animals. We naturally look for community. To be inseparable from society means that we cannot function without other people. It is inhuman to be separated, which is why things like isolation is obviously often used as punishment. Even just the nature of a prison, your main punishment in prison is to be taken out of society, to be removed from the main. So community and fraternity is a key socialist idea, this idea that we are social creatures and we thus need other people, not just in a kind of market sense that we need somebody to go and pick the apples, we need someone to transport them and then a market seller to sell them. But actually, we need humans in just a social level. The fact that interacting with human beings, having a conversation, laughing at jokes and things is just a very natural thing that we do as human beings. For example, human beings blush. That's quite a strange characteristic. We were thinking we were living in this survival of the fittest kind of world. Well, something like blushing, what's the evolutionary benefit of that? Well, the only thing that it actually does is reveal maybe we are embarrassed, we are shy or something. That's a weakness. But it's actually a way to bring empathy among human beings. The same as us smiling, right? It's all about effectively coding and speaking and building relationships with other human beings. So, but capitalists or liberals might argue, but if we're looking at human nature, it's cold, it's unkind, it's individualistic, it's about me, myself, and my family, and not much beyond that. Well, the argument that socialists argue is that effectively our human nature is malleable. It has been corrupted by capitalism. So in the sense that we are naturally inclined to be in society, we can have those ideas stripped from us in the sense that with our moldable plasticity of our human nature, we've basically adopted those ideas, but they're not our natural ideas. So we're very much shaped by nurture, not just simply by nature. So this obviously differs with the liberal ideas. So liberals believe that we are self-seeking individuals, and the only way that we're not harming each other is because we've committed to a social contract. So we're rational enough to give up some of our freedom, and that in the exchange of that, our natural competitiveness is going to be reduced and will be protected from each other. Whereas socialists believe we are social animals who thrive with community and cooperation, and we do not actually seek to harm each other. And as the poem by John Donne says, the sadness of mankind is something that diminishes me. If I see somebody harmed, I feel diminished, I feel sad. It's a tragedy for all of us. And these ideas, although kind of written down more recently, don't necessarily just pop up out of the 19th century. So this was addressed by Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, when he effectively argued that, well, socialism is a natural idea in many African countries. He argues that we in Africa have no real need to be converted to socialism than we have of being taught democracy. So he advocates for an African socialism, a socialism that stems not from the ideas of people like Karl Marx, but actually this idea that people always work together in communities. There was this idea that people were of equal worth, not just in terms of a legal sense, but actually in a community sense. If somebody is a human being, that is the only value that you attribute to them. You don't add more value to someone because they have more wealth. You don't add more value to someone because they have a degree or depending on the job that they have, for example. And it's because these pre-industrial societies, also in Europe as well, emphasize the importance of social life and the value of community. And if we're looking at the way settler colonialism has worked in places like Ireland, places like the Americas, they effectively aim to change the indigenous population's ideas of things like private property, where people shared land. They look to try to remove that natural inclination and convince them to move towards more closed off farming where people owned property in order to corrupt them. So it's like protect these traditional social values against Western individualism. So Western individualism is a colonial idea that has been forced upon other people in different countries. And this was commented on by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley when she wrote the book Frankenstein. So Frankenstein is actually the first ever science fiction novel. It's an incredibly interesting book to read. It's not even that long, so I do recommend it. And in essence, Frankenstein, it's a story about a monster that wreaks havoc, and it's the mask and Halloweens and things like that. But actually, the story of Frankenstein is much deeper than that. It's a dystopian story about a man called Dr. Frankenstein who, in his pursuit of knowledge, he manages to build a monster. He wants to do the one thing that humans haven't done yet. He wants to make life in his pursuit of knowledge, which is like a quest for godliness almost, to do the last obstacle. And in doing this, he basically completely abandons his duty to the woman that he loves. And in this pursuit of knowledge, he effectively chases this dream, and in doing that, he loses his humanity. So the monster is the product of that, and the monster is like a metaphor for industrialization. And it's this idea that, the loss of community because he's in his selfish desire for knowledge. And this community has become harder to achieve in these industrialized societies because these changes in industrialization are the decline of the society, in the sense that we work very long working hours. So especially in the 19th century, but now we still do as well. So because you work longer working hours, you have less actual physical time for socialization. You become a bit more protective of your time. You're a bit more tired as well. And the management structures and things like that within business promote this self-seeking ideology. So through this, human beings have become corrupted in this restless desire for progress, and at that, it's the expense of humanity. So this perversion of human nature, socialists argue, leads to the desire of competition over cooperation, and that's how capitalism has distorted human nature, according to socialists. So when we're thinking about what competition does, competition pits people against each other. It's a winner takes all kind of situation, and this goes against our human nature because it promotes selfishness and aggression. So there's long-term economic harm because there's a society of winners and losers. It limits development. So if you're thinking about, a main argument is that we wouldn't have had the iPhone if not for capitalism. But is the iPhone really the maximum development that we have in phones? Or is it that Apple hold back technological developments because they want to be able to sell us a new phone each year? So we don't have the most developed phone. We just had the most developed phone, or a phone that is limitedly developed in order to maximize profits. And what if actually, in some ways, Samsung do produce really good products too? What would happen if Apple and Samsung worked together instead of competing with each other? The argument is that the competition means that they're always trying to outdo each other, and because of this they end up doing better. But what if they actually cooperated instead? And the ultimate argument with capitalism is that effectively competition encourages and motivates people because there's higher reward the more success that you have. But then when you look at some of the most successful startups in the world, they often come from places like Denmark. Britain is actually quite lagging behind in the startup sector. So why is that? Why is Denmark more successful than Britain in that sector? Well, in essence, it's because in Denmark, if you want to start a startup company, which is effectively you have an idea and you want to spread that idea, you want to make a product, sell a product, provide a service or something like that. Just innovation, that's what a startup is. In Denmark, with a startup, you are given a safety net. So if your startup fails, you're not going to be homeless. You're not going to, be without. You're going to be safe. Whereas in the UK, it's very much like your risk. If you rolled a dice and you go for a startup and it fails, there's no support in funding for the startup like there is in Denmark, but also for your own personal safety net that is not available to you. And with the waning benefit system, it's even more difficult to have that safety net. So socialists argue that we should nurture relationships amongst humans, and that relationship should be one of cooperation. Cooperation means working together, collective effort intended to achieve mutual benefit. And there's this really interesting behavioural economist called Dan Ariely. He basically fuses psychology and economy together. He's a very, very interesting writer. And he writes this book called Predictably Irrational. And he does these experiments and he sees, if you give somebody a financial award, do they produce the best product? No, it's not true. It doesn't actually motivate you. Money motivates you to a certain point, but when you actually have enough, you're not actually that fast. I think it's like 70 grand a year or something. You're actually fine. The thing that he noticed motivated people was the opportunity for creativity. He found with some companies that he was working with, giving staff a Friday afternoon off to work on whatever they wanted meant that they ended up coming up with more ideas of marketing and things like that for the company when they had that freedom and that less of that management, that competition structure, than when they were motivated through financial reward. So it's this idea that human creativity is what drives innovation. The human desire to create, the human desire to make the world a better place, which is fostered through cooperation, and that actually leads to the development of society. So we have these bonds of sympathy, caring, and affection. If you're thinking about things like the fridge, creating a fridge is so you can keep meat for longer. You don't have to go to the supermarket and things like that. All these innovations are about improving the quality of life, and that's done through sympathy, caring, and affection, not through financial gain. So it's this idea of mutual aid coming together, and we're motivated through moral, not material interests. It's a very interesting argument. Would it hold up against the capitalist argument? So maybe think about what you think about that. Are you convinced by this idea that we are naturally competitive, or is it that we have this natural instinct to cooperate which leads to the betterment of society? So we've seen these things acted out in things like the cooperative, which is a kind of company, but effectively the way the company works is any profit that they make gets put back into the community. So it's not about making profit for their shareholders, it's about investing back into the shops, the supermarkets, to give customers better prices, better options. They also only use fair trade products as well, so they're not kind of having a harmful and moral footprint in the world too. So they do things, it's not just co-op food, which you've probably seen. They also provide things like funeral care, banks, travel, everything. So it's supposed to be the shop that can support you in your every need. And it's this acknowledgement that there are some benefits to material incentives. So it can be a reliable wealth creator. It's just that profit must be minimized, and any profit that comes from it should go towards improving society and community. Profit should be for the common good, not for an individual gain. And one of the very key parts of socialism is the way that they interpret the world. So as I mentioned earlier, we saw in 19th century London, we started to have this even geographical differences between rich and poor people, and that shaped kind of class consciousness. So class consciousness is a key aspect of a socialist vision for society. So you cannot have the change without having the class consciousness. And this was put forward, it's in one of the opening lines of the Communist Manifesto, when Karl Marx opened saying the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle. And what that effectively means is, in Karl Marx's views, that effectively every single historical change that has happened has always come about because one side is conscious of who they are, and then they become conscious that the other side is different to them. So that could have been serfs, so kind of peasants and landowners. They had that class consciousness, and then they created that difference, which led to the abolition of serfdom, right? You had, for example, landowners and aspiring peasants, the gentry, and that led to the ideas of the gentry associating with ideas of liberalism, and the landed aristocracy trying to protect the ideas of feudalism, and then the idea of liberalism won out, which gave birth to capitalism. So Karl Marx argues that inevitably, because capitalism is so bad, the working classes will become conscious that they are working class. The middle class will be conscious that they are middle class, and they'll work to destroy each other, which he believed would eventually end in the victory of the working classes. So to them, social class is the deepest and most politically significant divide. So that's saying that class is more important than gender, class is more important than race, sexuality, because it's the common experiences of all mankind. So they would argue against so-called identity politics, and argue that that's quite fractious, and that everybody needs to unite together under class consciousness. Although it's complicated, I think it's not that simple, because there are classes within classes, in the sense that the experience of a black woman is not the same experience as a white woman, even if they are both working class people. So it's saying that the class is the most important divide, and class consciousness is very true, and that's an important aspect. You cannot be free until you realise that you are not free. But is class really the most important social divide in society? So social class is like an economic division, but that leads to a social difference. So obviously if you're poor, you have less opportunities in life and things like that. So equality then is quite an important aspect. So when we're thinking about what does it mean to be equal, is it about equal opportunity, work hard, and you can thrive, you can have those opportunities to go to school and so forth? Or is it actually everybody should have the same? Everybody should have a house, everybody should have good education, everybody should have a car or whatever it is, but should we all have the same thing? And what would that look like? Because there are issues of equality of opportunity. So when we think about that old idea from Einstein, a fish will forever, and I'm paraphrasing here, a fish will forever think it's stupid if it cannot climb a tree. Because we do different things, we have different strengths, we have different skill sets, and society should be built around nurturing all of those skill sets, not just the ones that provide the highest monetary value. So this kind of cartoon on the bottom right there, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. So obviously the monkey's going to do well. I'm not so sure how that penguin's going to do, and so forth. So is it as simple as we should all run the same race? We should all do the same tests to decide who are the winners and the losers in this winner-take-all society? Is it as simple as legal rights? So are LGBTQ plus people equal now because there's now equal marriage? But maybe marriage is the problem anyway. Maybe the institution of marriage is the issue rather than who can and can't have access to it. So it's an interesting thing to think about. To socialists, a society that is equal is a society where you have equality of outcome, although socialists have begun to differ in the extent to which they believe in that. So we talked about this before in the sense that there's the virtues of social equality. So society will be morally better off if everybody is equal. So inequality is not solely a result of difference in abilities, but it is structural. So like I said, if the test is climbing a tree, people will have different abilities in doing that. So instead there should be an element of egalitarianism. So the desire to promote equality. Equality is the primary political value. So how successful is a country? Well, we measure it today about how good our economy is. We measure that by things like interest rates and stuff like that. And like Keir Starmer's always say, we're going to grow the economy. What does that actually mean? Well, it means that Labour's primary goal is an economic one. But to a socialist, the goal is not about having a big economy or anything. It's actually about having equality, everybody being the same. So a society is successful, the more equal people are. So liberation is removing the fence. Equity is people having what they need. So Karl Marx said, each according to his ability, each according to his needs. So we shouldn't all get the same thing because we all have different needs. But everything should be geared towards making sure that everybody has access to everything and everybody is equal. If you're already able to climb a tree, you don't need a ladder to help you get up there. If you're not able to climb a tree, you should be given a ladder, and so forth. So the issues with equality of opportunity is that it legitimizes inequality. So there's this myth of innate inequality, and it promotes social Darwinism. So the idea that those who are on the top are there because they have the greatest merit. They're there because they've worked the hardest and the most intelligent, and so they deserve the greater reward. Well, the problem with that is it justifies inequality. And to socialists, all inequality is wrong. Instead, equality of outcome says to abolish private property, to promote community instead of division, and it's needs satisfaction. So everything is centered around human fulfillment and self-realization. We should be able to read, we should be able to grow and develop ourselves. Why is it that we spend so much of our lives at work? You spend more time with the person you sit at the desk next to you at work than you do with your own family. So is that actually a healthy society? Or is it one where people are starved of fulfillment? And this is quite a hard thing to imagine. What would a life be like without private property? Should we have the right to private property? Because actually, when you think about it, what does property actually result in? Well, property results in a divide of those who have property and those who do not have property. It's strange when you think about it. And then their worth, their value comes out of that. And you might think, well, I like to have my phone, I like to have my iPad or whatever, But property is not the same thing as possessions. So it's not saying every single person's going to have the same phone or anything like that, because that's not what property is. Property is something called productive wealth. So the things like your labour. So when you go to work, you sell your property, you sell your labour to your boss. Real estate, so things like houses and land and things like that. Resources and knowledge are also property. Is it right that when somebody publishes a scientific report that might even have something in it that could lead to the cure to cancer, is it right that they should sell that? So they've worked on it, they've spent their labour on it, they've invested time and their energy, and they've used their knowledge to write it. But if they put a price on it, a patent on it, not everybody will be able to benefit from that discovery. Is it right that one person can be individualistic and profit from that, which limits the amount of access people have to a life-saving treatment? Or should it be that there is no property and any knowledge that is produced is shared with everybody? And that also includes capital as well. So French anarchist Proudhon, he argued that all property is theft. Whoa, that's a strong statement. How is property theft? Property can be acquired fairly, surely. What does that actually mean? And he effectively is arguing that there is no such thing as a property being acquired fairly, or any property being acquired fairly. You might have the property of knowledge because you've had better circumstances to allow you to go to university and things like that, for example. But also, all property is theft because property is unjust. Wealth is produced by collective effort, and so it should be community owned. So in order to build a house, you need a builder, of course. But the builder needs to know what they're doing, and in order to do that, they need a planner. The builder also needs bricks, and it's the brick maker who makes those bricks to give them to the builder, and so on. So it cannot be done without any of those parts. Therefore, why does it make sense that somebody who already owns a lot of property and a lot of wealth is able to buy a house and give a small portion of the profit to those who made it? So property is unjust because it's always acquired unfairly. And it's also morally corrupting. A problem with property is that people become obsessed with the accumulation of it. So Jeff Bezos is worth billions. That's more money than he can ever count. That's more than he can ever do with. It takes 32 years to count to $1 billion. It's a ridiculous amount of money. So him having this property could be distributed and shared amongst people, and he would still live quite an affluent life. But it's this obsession about collecting it, which is not good for the economy in the end. So the rich want more property whilst the poor want some. People become more and more materialistic as well. And I think a good example of that is in The Simpsons, with the episode when Bart wants a game called I forgot the name of it, Bloodborne, I think. And effectively he really wants this game, but his mum says no. And he gets really upset and he decides to steal it. So Bart steals a game. He's committed a moral. It's morally questionable. It's wrong that he's stolen this game, but nonetheless, would he have stolen it if it hadn't have been sold to him on TV? If he wasn't watching these adverts telling him that, in this life of capitalism where you're so desperately unhappy, this game is going to make you happy. You're going to belong with other people who also have this game. So he's become corrupted because of the materialism of capitalism. The other thing is property is divisive. It fosters conflict. You have a situation where it's the worker versus the owner. Those who have property, who own it, buy the labour of workers and force them to work in these companies, these jobs, for a minuscule salary. And the idea is you maximise profit, you're maximising the success of your company. But why don't we consider the maximum happiness of our workers as well? You also end up with a society of rich versus poor, which to Karl Marx is the inevitable conflict. Although, of course, we've not had many all-out wars as a result of this, but it does lead to division in society rather than harmony and cooperation. So to socialists, the answer to property is to abolish it. So all property ownership should be abolished, in the sense that all wealth, and there's different ideas about how this works. It could be through taxation, it could be through the seizing of property, but effectively, property should be state owned. It should be owned by the state to redistribute amongst the people. And it could be eventually that there is no state, the withering away of the state. But in essence, property should not exist. No single person should own property, because the generation of property leads to those having it and those not having it. It leads to the corruption of people. So with socialists who have been in power, such as the Labour Party, who were social democrats, they argued in their version that there should be the common ownership of production. So this is done through taxation, and all the commanding heights should be nationalised. So commanding heights like British Gas, because we all need to have energy, the NHS, because we all need to have healthcare, even housing was nationalised, and the idea was that everybody could have a council house because nobody should own property. Steel, electricity as well. So all these kind of key aspects of society. So the things where a company could make profit off of you because you're having to buy their service, you have no alternative. That should be owned by the state, because then it can be delivered fairly, high quality, and at a fair price that people can afford. So I've just talked through some of those core ideas of socialism, but the issue is that socialism isn't a fully united ideology, just like we've seen with liberalism. And this is a great quote. It's this idea that English socialists seem to have little but the label in common. You've got people who are talking about revolutionary socialism. Let's totally tear up the society and start again, because the society was built on unfair foundations and therefore it cannot be saved. As Audre Lorde said, the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house. But the problem was, according to a historian called Himmelfarb, was that this revolutionary socialism was a bit foreign to British ideas. British people, according to Himmelfarb, are kind of naturally conservatives. They don't like too much change. And socialism or Marxism or communism was a foreign export that had never become or never became completely domesticated. So this idea that there's only one solution, revolution, did not really take much root in England. And in fact, other ideas sprung up. There's an idea of evolutionary socialism, for example, which, although also wanted to totally remove capitalism, it wanted to achieve it through almost like a bureaucratic way, to have like an administrative class who would help to slowly remove capitalism, but do it in a very peaceful way. So social change through reform, to tame the beast, but not to kill it. And that's definitely becomes even more watered down with ideas of like social democracy, which kind of came out of evolutionary socialism, but evolutionary socialism wanted to remove capitalism still, whereas social democracy actually just wanted to reform it, to make it work for the workers. And then the most recent variation, the third way, the ideas of Tony Blair, that capitalism is actually just a reliable system and we should stop trying to fight it and just start trying to integrate it more fairly into society. So a very divided ideology. And what we're going to be considering in our next inquiry is, can socialism be achieved through this compromise? Are you able to adjust and take out parts of socialism and ultimately still achieve socialist principles?